partner with different institutions like museums and archives across India. The aim of our program is basically to activate the collections that are within museums and archival spaces, and we engage both with scholarly and creative kind of engagements. So SL Bhatia this year was one of our partners, and this was a creative engagement because the museum wanted any other kind of audiences apart from scholars and academicians who usually engage with the space. And Akash is one of the coordinators. We have also Meera, who's another coordinator from the same museum collection. To formally introduce, Akash is a prehistoric archaeologist with research interests concerning paleo anthropology and archaeology. He is also a resource person for childhood history and co-host of the podcast Chipping. And Akash is one of the final deliveries is a series of podcasts with 12 episodes that is going to be out for all of us towards the end of the project. And this project has been, it's a foundation project implemented by India Foundation for the Arts under our AD program in collaboration with SL Bhatia. And this has been made possible with the part supporting Parijat Foundation. So, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Today you are at the History of Medicine Museum. So that takes two concepts, history and medicine, and tries to look at how medicine and medical practices in general have developed. What I'm looking at is giving a different perspective, is like how through the study of skeletal remains, which come under the general purview of medical and medical practices, has contributed towards our understanding of the past. I'm an archaeologist, and one of the things we look at is, amongst the various resources as we go ahead, is human skeletal remains. Okay, so just a crash course in archaeology. So what is archaeology? So archaeology is the study of human society through the analysis of the material culture. History also studies the human past, but it's basically on written sources. So what somebody thought was important to note and write, that is what comes through history. But archaeology is a study of material culture. So be it buildings, be it structures, be it tools, be it clothing, and also the human body. So archaeology is derived from the Greek archaeos, which is ancient, and logos, which is study. So literally it's the study of the ancient. Okay, so as we know, before we have history, which is only about 5,000 years old, we've had human beings living, even as humans, or as not as Homo sapiens, but various species like Homo erectus, Australopithecine, that led to human culture that we know of today. So we can date back the earliest use of material culture to about 3.3 million years ago to a site in Africa which has the first stone tools. So the period from 3.3 million years to the present is the purview of archaeology. However, with history, we just have to share the last 5,000 years. And it's an interdisciplinary study because the past was and is as complex as the present. So how to study the present? We have multiple disciplines. We need the same to study the past as well. To study the present. Well, you get the gist. So not only that, the traces that we have from the past is few and far between. So it's like trying to complete a puzzle where you don't know how many pieces are there, what pieces you have, and where the pieces fit. So we have to apply a lot of scientific methodologies. So be it stable isotopes to try and reconstruct environment, or the study of the human body, either to see how we evolved as a species, or various other aspects as we'll see today. Okay, and like I said, it is the only source of information from prehistoric societies. So prehistoric societies are societies before writing, which, like I said, covers the period from 3.5 million years to about 5,000 years, where we have the earliest writing. In India, the earliest writing is only about 4,000 years ago with the Indus Valley civilization. However, we still don't know what they wrote because the script is not deciphered. So you could say history technically starts in India only with the Ashokan inscriptions. Okay, so that is why archaeology is important, because one, it shows the study of human evolution. How did we become human, which is the primary crux, and slowly also how the various aspects of the human body develop. Along with human development, it's also cultural development and evolution. Human beings are this one species that instead of actually evolving their bodies, we outsourced our evolution to culture. Imagine if humans have to go to a cold place Rather, imagine an elephant who has to go to a cold place. Over thousands of years, it becomes a woolly mammoth. Correct? Because it has to deal with the cold. What did humans do? They hunted the woolly mammoth, used its fur, we invented fire. So to deal with environmental problems, we used culture, not our own body. And archaeology, being the study of material culture, also helps us study how we adapted to various societies and climatic modifications. This ability of us to modify the environment to suit us is what we are currently going through with massive global change, global climate change, because we've changed the environment so much that we ourselves are probably going to become victims of it. So archaeology gives us this ability to see the long durée, the long time period through which we can understand how these changes have started, and maybe also give us answers to how we can overcome them. At the same time, it's the study of various technologies: fire, metal, stone tools, furniture, clothing. All of these technologies are the result of many years of growth and development, and through the long time span that we can understand through archaeology, we can study the development of technologies and hopefully find novel, challenging ways to look at, possible solutions for our current problems. Like I already said, it is the only source of information for prehistoric societies, and also when we have historical records, it can help corroborate them. We are all familiar with the Vedas, or the various versions of the Vedas, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana. They have tall tales. However, some of it seem to be rooted in archaeological thought, and that is where we can try and see if what is being written can have an actual realistic basis. So there is the Vedic period, which goes for about 1,000 years in the past. What we find in the archaeological record is not as fancy or elaborate as what is written. So we know that there is some embellishment. So when you are writing something, you're not always going to write what you see, right? You want to add an element of, mystery, of elaboration. That's part of literature, and that's what we study. So here we can actually corroborate what is written, how much of it is actual, how much of it is a later addition also in time. Like going back, it's another important primary source. If you're not going to have a structure, the evidence of the structure will not be there. So this corroborates as a primary source, while literature serves as a secondary source. So through the long durée, the long time span that we can use archaeology to study, we can understand the development of societies as well as individual settlements. So we know that Bangalore was there from at least the 1500s. Why? Because we found through excavation we found inscriptions, we found settlements, we found structures. In one of these inscriptions that is currently in the government museum next to Vishvesvaraya, that has the earliest reference to Bangalore. And by dating that, we know how old Bangalore can be. Also, in and around Bangalore, you know that you have the Kempegoda Towers, which outline the original boundaries of the city. So, through the study of archaeology, we can understand the stories of various settlements. Say, for example, Delhi. Delhi is one storied city like that. It has had many forms: Indraprastha, Shahjahanpur. All of these places are different phases of how Delhi grew. Where Purana Qila is currently, even though it's part of Delhi, it was another city in the past. And that's why New Delhi refers to a new Delhi, not any of the old Delhis that were there. It also helps in resolving various issues and problems. For example, the contention over the West Bank, various other issues which maybe let's keep away from this discussion, that can be its own talk. But archaeology helps, like I said, because it's a primary source, it can question and challenge and criticize what is written and help solve various issues, problems. And finally, archaeology also helps in conserving our past, both because it's an active effort to study the past, and also through the understanding of how technologies have developed through time, help in conservative architecture. How can we protect forts? How can we protect palaces? How can we protect old buildings? So archaeology also contributes to that. So in short, archaeology is basically the study of what makes us human, both in terms of our physical body as well as a cultural body. So archaeological finds are of many kinds. You have structures, you have coins, you have inscriptions, you have plant remains, animal remains. But the focus of this talk is going to be just our human remains. So some kinds of remains that you can see. You have stone tools, you have jewelry, underwater archaeology, which is basically the study of things that are submerged. That includes settlements, that includes shipwrecks, all of those things, and one of those important elements being human burials and the human skeletal remains. How has it contributed? Let's see, one step at a time. First, human evolution. Well, fossils of human beings, be it say these different species, we are Homo sapiens. So we as a species are only about 300,000 years old. However, like I said, we have material culture going back 3.3 million years ago. So humans as a species diverged from the common ancestor of the chimpanzee about 7 million years ago. And one of these reasons is through bipedalism. The other is a good grip, dexterity to use tools, or large brain size. All of these have actual impacts on the physical skeleton. So the way the pelvic girdle joins the the femur, or for example the elaboration of the cranial capacity. All of these things we can see in the skeletal remains, and through this we can trace how humans as a species evolved and how they spread to various parts of the world. That is why we say that Africa is the homeland of humans, because we know that the oldest specimens are coming from Africa. Unfortunately, the various climatic conditions in India have not preserved a lot of these fossils. However, we have one specimen from a site in the Narmada Valley, which is a partial cranium of a species that we have not been able to identify yet. So hopefully more such specimens in the near future, with active research going on, can help contribute to that. Even as early as June, I was actually in this site working, and we probably found a new elephant species. Hopefully in the next few years that will be published. But there's always something more in archaeology. Some people say, why are you digging it up? Don't we already know everything in the past? Well, every time we dig up something, like I said, it's a small piece of a massive puzzle that we don't know anything about. So this is me in the Neanderthal Museum. You see, even though their skeletons, their craniums look different, if you probably dress them up in what we are wearing today, they might as well look as we do. So they as people, like I said, were as complex in the past as we are in the present. So it's just that we might know a little bit more than what they did, but that's again an aspect of human culture, is that we had the ability to write, we had the ability to pass on information from one generation to the other, to teach. That is something we see with stone tools. You need to have language to teach how to make stone tools. You can't just look at somebody break stone and try and recreate it. We'll see that later. I tried to do that, so that's why. So bipedalism, like I said, is one of these important aspects of the human culture, or rather what makes us human. And this is something we realize through the study of the skeletal remains. I mean, we're all familiar with these different memes, right? Of how bipedalism, while pushing us in one direction, has also helped us, maybe not be that transformative. So through the study of both extinct living species like the chimpanzees, the monkeys, and even humans, as well as those of the past, we can see how the association of the femur and the pelvis has changed through time. It shows that about at least 3 million years ago, we were walking upright. So which means at least 3 million years ago, we had free hands. And that shows in the archaeological record, right? But 3.3 million years, we had stone tools. So we were already walking on 2 feet by 3 million years ago, and that we can understand through the study of the skeletal remains, both of ancient species and of living contemporary species. Another important part of the human body are teeth. The skull, the teeth, and teeth, because they are coated with enamel, are the most preserved of the archaeological skeletal remains. So most species, when we saw skulls in the previous one, most of the other species that we know of are basically through teeth. And why are teeth important? Because one, it tells us about our diet, like what we ate. So the teeth of herbivores is different from the teeth of carnivores, which is different from the teeth of omnivores. Even if you are a herbivore, what kind of plants or fruits you eat also is shown in your teeth. So by studying teeth, you can understand the diet of the past, and through that also reconstruct the environment. I mean, if you're going to eat a particular fruit, that fruit has to be in your environment, right? Else why would you eat it? It will be very difficult. I mean, they didn't have Amazon back in the day where you could get things from other places delivered. At the same time, teeth are also important to look at ontogeny or the development. Children have milk teeth, which they lose and they get permanent teeth. So if you can find milk teeth in the archaeological record, or the study what kind of teeth are in the mandible, we can try and age the specimen. So we know that there is a specimen known as Narya-Katome boy, who is found in Turkana, which is in East Africa, and we know he's 1.8 meters tall, 180 centimeters, and he was still a young child. He's not matured as an adult. So maybe he would have probably grown to be 2 feet. He was a Homo erectus specimen. But we know, that he's a child, but even though he had the dimensions of something that could be an adult human, he was still a child. So this is some stories we can get. Another thing is regarding the health. So whenever we have malnutrition, it shows on our teeth. They have these specific bands that grow in the enamel, because while you're growing, your enamel is being deposited. Because you have milk teeth outside, the other teeth that are inside, they're developed as you grow. So if there's any, say, famine, if there's any malnutrition, it shows on the teeth. So we can understand individual health of the specimen because we can look at these teeth records. Also the facial structure. People talk about, ape-like faces, prognatism is the scientific term for it. So based on the orientation and association of the teeth, we can look at how the modern face developed. So this face that we have today is something that's only developed in the last 10,000 years. Could anybody take a guess why it's only in the last 10,000 years? Soft diet. We have agriculture, so we start settling down, we start eating soft foods, we are cooking our food. So the teeth don't need to do that much effort. Even now the teeth are evolving, right? We are getting so many people who are not getting their wisdom tooth. Or so many people where the wisdom tooth is causing issues that it has to be pulled out. So this is because our diet, our facial structure, all of these things are affected. And through the study of teeth and the mandible, we can understand these changes from a long period of time. And also, like I said, teeth are what are preserved more than half the time. So because of that, we can look at migration of species throughout different parts of the world. So one of these examples comes from southern Italy, where I used to work on, and we found this small teeth which we didn't know which species it belonged to. So when we compared it, it belonged to a separate species known as Homo heidelbergensis, a Heidelberg man. So through this we can understand how people move to how various species moved and at what time they were present where, and through that we can try and piece together a little bit of our lost past. Okay, so like I said, so you see the teeth there. So those are teeth depending on different human species, different animal species, and you see these two images. You see how these are much bigger than those. I scaled them down to the same scale. You can see these teeth are much bigger. So the reason why they were much bigger is because these species were used to eating grass and nuts. So grass is a lot of silica, so it erodes away at your teeth, your enamel, so they need to have large surfaces, like how cattle do. Correct? And we, even going back to Homo erectus, had smaller teeth, which means we had already become omnivores by that point of time. Apart from the fact that we have evidence of hunting and scavenging, the human body itself is showing these evolutionary traits. Okay? Another important aspect that we learn from the skeletal remains is about dexterity, the ability for us to do this. Not many other species can do that. This gave us handling ability, to use tools, to make tools. And this kind of technology led us to where we are. Like I said, the evolution of the human skull, it also takes time. So each part of the human brain has some control over different cognitive capacities. The part of the brain that is here is responsible for sight. So when we know in Neanderthals, this bit was more developed than it is in modern humans. Which means because they were living in snowy ice age conditions, they had to see better, right? There's always snowstorms, it's always white. So we know that this bit of the brain adapted to that. Spatial cognition, thinking, the frontal lobe, this is developed over the last 1.5 million years, which means Homo erectus was as smart as us. So like I said, you dress them up like that and bring them to modern time, you wouldn't find any difference with them and us. So like I said, movement and migration through time is another thing, because while we have stone tools, anybody can make stone tools, right? I can make stone tools from the past. Doesn't mean the presence of a stone tool implies the presence of a particular species. And multiple species made multiple kinds of stone tools, and the same kind of stone tool was made by multiple species. So you can't equate 1:1. So the actual presence of the human skeletal remain is what is needed. So like I said, unfortunately in India we just have one cranial specimen which we can't identify yet, but this is not the case for the rest of the world. So one, we know because of this that it started in Africa and moved out of Africa. Also, not only that, sometimes it moved back into Africa. It moved to different parts of the world. So it's not like one day they got up in Africa and said, I'm going to India or I'm going to North America, right? It's a slow, gradual process, and along the way they adapted their culture, they adapted themselves and their environment as they moved across. Also, it was not just one particular wave. It happened slowly through time because of demographic pressures. Each natural environment can only host so many numbers of a particular species. If more of them come up, they either have to move or they have to die out, because competition for resources is something that existed always through time. So that is why through time multiple waves of different species moved beyond Africa, and some of it also led to possible indigenous evolutions in different parts of the world which we might still try and study. So for example, everybody knows of Hobbit man in Flores. That is an independent evolution because of the island environment. So that species reached Indonesia when it was still low sea levels and it could get there. But then once the island became isolated, they had to evolve to become smaller to survive on these resources. So it's not just in Java that we have that, you also see that in the Philippines. A couple of years ago, a new species was published called Homo luzonensis from Luzon, which is the northern island of the Philippines, which has the same features of island dwarfism. And this also, like I said, helps date different species. These fossils also become important as a source of ancient DNA. DNA studies in the recent past have tried to show ancestry, correct? But these are ancestries only of modern day population. Like I said, we have multiple species, multiple waves, and all of these dead ends might not have contributed to us. So by studying these ancient skeletal remains, we can reconstruct ancient populations and these dispersals, and also identify new species, which we'll go into, and also hybridization between species. And with advancements of various other technologies, say geometric morphometrics, which includes scanning these skeletal remains, we can identify new species as well as develop population level characteristics, which is of the need for the moment, at least in South Asia. So I don't know if it's visible clearly, but this is actually the map of a very particular and very important group known as the Indo-European group. So they start off in a region of Central Asia, where you see number 2, and from there they move everywhere, bringing their Indo-European languages. That is why we have similarities in words in Hindi, in German, in Latin, in French. It's because this is this one group that over a few thousand years probably replaced a lot of population all the way from England till North India. We know this because of genetic studies that are carried on modern species, on modern humans, as well as ancient populations. Okay, so what do we know about the Indian genetic data? We know about 9,000 years ago, these prehistoric people, not the steppe people that we're looking at, the ancient stone tool bearing people were living in various parts of India, and their genetic code is what we call the ancient ancestral South Indian data set. Around 9,000 years ago, we have one group of people coming in and mixing with them, bringing with them agriculture, bringing with them domestication that we see at sites such as Mehergarh in modern day Pakistan. However, by about 4,000 years ago, which is equivalent to the Harappans, we see that the genetic code had somewhat diversified. You had something known as the ancestral South Indians and the ancestral North Indians. And about 2,000 years ago, you have this steppe element with the Indo-European languages coming in, and that results in the present day South Asians. So not only have the ancestral North Indians and South Indians merged, you also have this Iranian element, you also have this steppe element that's coming in. We can date this introduction because when we studied the DNA of one Harappan specimen, we found it didn't have the steppe element. The steppe element is this Indo-European thing, so that is the steppe element. The ones that speak the Indo-European languages. So we know that the Harappans did not have the steppe element. Again, we know it only from one specimen because the acidic nature of the soil makes bone preservation itself low, and also even if the bones are preserved, the DNA might not be preserved. So even after 100 years of work with Harappans, we only managed to get one specimen to get proper DNA out of. But that shows that the steppe element was not there. So anybody that tells you that the Harappans are the Vedic Europeans, you can say science doesn't say so. Another thing science also says, or DNA says, is that we can identify species from even small fragments. So there is this one cave called Denisova, which is in Siberia, where in 2010 they took this small bone fragment, they thought it belonged to a Neanderthal, and they ran it through their sequencing machines, and it came out to be completely different. And that is how we know of this new species called the Denisovans, which we can't find from the skeletal record. From what, in the sense you don't have large skeletons, you just have small little fragments. And not only that, when they looked at various other specimens from this site, you could find multiple episodes of Denisovans. Denisovans were living with Neanderthals. The archaeology, as you can see in green, doesn't overlap with the skeletal remains. Which means if you are just focusing on the archaeology, you would think at this point of time nobody lived. So when we date these skeletal remains, we say that occupation in various regions cannot just be based on the archaeological evidences as such, but you also need to look at these skeletal remains. Another thing we find based on DNA, multiple species. You have the Denisovans, you have the Neanderthals, another hominid species that we don't know yet, work is being done, and one that is of mixed ancestry. Which means Denisovan 11, the one you see with half blue and half red, had one parent who was a Neanderthal and one parent who was a Denisovan. So which means, like I said, if you take away their ancient dressing style and put them in the modern clothes, they would look no different from us. That was there in the past too. And we had these hybridization. Even when we look at our modern day DNA, about 1 to 5% of it has Neanderthal DNA and about 1 to 3% has Denisovan DNA. So which means we are all descended from some mixed groups and hybridization events. We probably took something that's beneficial from these different species that grew in different environments and adapted it to our own benefit. Also, like I spoke of, geometric morphometrics. It's basically where you take these different skeletal elements from different parts of the world, you digitize them, make them into 3D models, and then you collect different pieces of information from them by marking them. This way, we can try and understand how people moved around. The chart, I don't know if it's very visible, but basically it shows how different populations are related, how different populations could have interacted. So this helps us qualify and quantify our genetic data sets also. Now moving into more recent times, activity-induced stress markers. What are these? So basically, whenever you're using your body over prolonged periods of time, it leaves an impact on your skeleton. And through that, we can try and, this is already affected by, gender, by sex, by age, by the genetic components. However, we can try and study what kind of movements, what kind of work, what kind of activities they could have done. So here I'll be using some of my own work that I worked with a couple of collaborators, wherein we looked at skeletal remains from these different sites in India. Jotsoma, which is in Nagaland, which is a megalithic site about 1500 years ago. Then you have Balupur, another megalithic site about 2000 years ago, and Kodumanar, which is about 3000 years ago, to see if there is any particular patterns, any activities they did over these periods of time. So we've looked at 21 skeletal elements, complete elements, whatever we could find from these species, and what we realized is that there are these activity markers. So the vertebra you see shows arthritis. The shin bone, so that is this bone, has an interesting feature. There is something known as a squatting facet. We as Indians squat a lot. So this behavior goes back at least 3000 years ago. And we see this in various South Asian populations of something known as a squatting facet. You see the depression where the red arrow is there, which means that people have been squatting in India for a long, long time. Apart from that, what we see is that there is more markers on the upper body, which means the upper body was used a lot more than the lower body. And another thing that we see is that with age, these markers increase. So young adults don't have that much, middle age have a little bit more, and in older population, these markers are very pronounced. Which means that's something we see now also, as we grow older, we realize, back is aching, joints are aching. So this kind of behavior goes back and is something that we see through the time. And one of it could be the fact that, our body might have evolved for bipedalism, but it's still a recent evolution. Like I said, it's only 3 million years ago that we started walking upright. So it's going to take some time for us to get used to it. So one more fun fact that we can looking at ancient murder mysteries. Okay, so this skeletal element, this body was actually found in the Alps on the border of Switzerland and Italy, and when hikers found it, they called the police. Because the police, we found a body, come check it out. And the police came, picked it up, took it back, and then they tested, and they found that the body is actually 3000 years old and a little bit beyond the jurisdiction of the modern Italian police. Okay, so then archaeologists were involved, and then we figured it out, and then we saw that this was a Bronze Age man who was trying to cross the Alps. And when we studied them, we realized that he has an arrow in his shoulder. Somebody actually killed him and then left the body there, and nobody knew. So we find these ancient murder mysteries and that we can try and solve. So based on what he was carrying, we could say that he was probably a tribal leader of this Bronze Age civilization, because he had some equipment that only leaders would have. We could identify what kind of diet he had. He had eaten basically muesli, basically gruel. He had that, and he had left on his morning voyage, probably going to hunt because he had his bow and his arrows, and then somebody shot him in the back. Apart from that, all over Northern Europe, because preservation conditions are good, in something known as peat bogs, we find bodies like this. Some have been interpreted as sacrifices. Some people think that they committed suicide and killed themselves, and some people thought, this was a highway robbery. Somebody stole whatever they had, killed them, and put them in these bogs. Okay, you have them in parts of Denmark, you have them in parts of Scotland, and through them we can understand how they look like. So this specimen, if you can see properly, has red hair, and this was something that we found from northern Scotland. And we know red hair is a feature that is very Scottish and Irish. So this image here is from the site of Skele-Tales, which is in modern day Germany, and this is the evidence of the first recorded war that we know of. So about 6000 years ago, which is Neolithic times where agriculture has just started, you had in Skele-Tales a group of people fighting each other, killing themselves. You have arrows stuck in their body, you have blunt force trauma on the head, and when archaeologists went there to see why, they realized the battlefield was over a bridge. So this bridge connected an important trading route, and two groups thought that this bridge was so important that it's worth fighting for over a large scale. So this is the first recorded concrete evidence of war that we so far have. Maybe more work will show that maybe there was older phases of war. That debate is always there, right? Were we always good and did society and culture make us bad, or were we always bad and society and culture tempers us? So hopefully in the near future we can maybe solve this debate. What I think is that we were always animals and society tries and controls us.
What is the white bit in that?
Oh, that's an arrowhead.
Oh.
So that's an arrow that's actually stuck here. Painful, right? So powerful that it went actually into the bone.
Is that iron?
That is a stone, it's called chert, Chert is a kind of stone. You get agates, you get jasper, right? It's in the same category as that. So they made an arrowhead out of that and they shot that guy. Again, guy. Because men were the one who had time enough to go fight. One more thing is that, come on, history of medicine, you're also supposed to look at medicine. How, one, we've contributed to the study of medicine and how the study of medicine has contributed to archaeology. Okay, I don't know why the syphilis one is not coming up. But yeah, so as I said, most of our illnesses are in the soft tissue which don't get preserved. However, there are various diseases such as leprosy, syphilis, tuberculosis that leave its impact on the human bone, on the human skeletal remain. So we have evidence of leprosy going back thousands of years ago, evidence of syphilis going back 1,000 years, and even in India, there's a site called Burza Home in Kashmir, which is a Neolithic site about 5,000 years ago, 5,000 years old, and in some of those skeletons we find evidence of leprosy and tuberculosis. So at least in India, at least 5,000 years ago, we have these diseases. Syphilis, I'm sorry, the image is not shown, has an interesting story. So syphilis, when it was first identified amongst various populations, it was coeval to the time when people started exploring the New World. It was first found in Europe, and the French called it the Spanish disease, the Spanish called it the English disease, because it was a sexually transmitted disease and it disfigures your body. Okay, and they wanted to blame it on the others because they are the ones who bought it. And the Europeans in general thought, hey, no, maybe we got it from the New World. So they called it the American disease. At the same time, we know that these diseases actually decimated 90% of the indigenous Americans that made way for colonization of the New World. So, however, more recently, in the last 5 years, 10 years, when they were excavating a monastery in northern Scotland, dated to around 11th, 12th century, we found a lot of evidence of syphilis. And this was 300 years before, Christopher Columbus went on his voyage to try and, find the Indies. So we know syphilis is already there, but it was contained in small groups. What happened is that when during the Renaissance and Reformation and later period, people started moving across spaces where you had, marriages between the middle class, that is the upcoming merchants, and the royalty and the common people. That is when syphilis, which was located in a small group of population, spread amongst various parts of Europe. When you have these diseases, obviously people wanted to solve them, correct? So one of the earliest ways, cures for syphilis was pouring boiling mercury on the sores. So if syphilis didn't kill you, the cure definitely did. So you have this evidence of a skull here wherein the mercury has actually burned the skull. Not only that, we have evidence of various cultural practices like the skull elongation, the skull binding, that we know from various populations. In China, they used to bind the feet. So all of these things leaves an impact on the human remains. There's also one of the earliest surgeries that we know of is something known as trepanation, which is basically drilling a hole in your skull because of blood pressure affecting your skull, affecting your thinking. And this was originally carried out during Neolithic times, about 10 to 6,000 years ago. And through time, this process was lost. What happened when people started in the Middle Ages, or rather post the Middle Ages in the Renaissance, when they started digging up, bodies, digging up remains, they found these skulls with holes. And at that point of time, everybody was questioning everything. So people why were they digging these holes? And then they started experimenting, and they realized that it would help ease blood pressure. So you had it originally in Neolithic times, then it reoccurs in medieval times, and something that we are also trying to do in the modern times to tackle schizophrenia. So a recent paper said that probably trepanation can help patients of schizophrenia deal with it. Not only that, you also had implants. So you see here the skull on the left, somebody's actually shaped an iron object because they had a skull injury and implanted it to seal that hole. So you had surgeries, you had implants going back at least a few thousand years. And not only that, you also have evidence of caregiving. Human beings have always been caregiving, either to each other or to even their pets. So we have evidence of these injuries. You see the skull with a massive hole or a depression, it's completely healed. If you have such a big hole in your skull, it makes living everyday life difficult. That means somebody actually took care of them took care of their infections. That means they had an idea of what to do with infections. This is a fracture in the bone of your hand. So somebody actually during that point of time took care of them, fed them, gave them all the necessities. So we can understand this process of caregiving is deeply rooted in human societies in the past. And another aspect that we get is the culture itself is depicted through the human body. So death and burial practices are something that is integral to every culture and society. And each culture and society has its own way of dealing with its dead. Correct? So when we have some cultures that have multiple ways of dealing with their dead, we can think that it's a multicultural society. The Harappans are one such example. They not only had primary burials, as we see there, where the whole body was buried, they had secondary burials. So secondary burials are similar to what we know with the Zoroastrians and the Parsis. You leave it out for a while, and sometimes you go collect it, and then whatever is left behind you bury it. So we have evidence of the secondary burials, and we also have evidence of symbolic burials. Somebody might have died elsewhere. You never could recover their body. However, because you believed in a life after death, you still dug a pit, you still gave them grave goods, and you still symbolically buried them. So what this means is that there are at least 3 different groups. Correct? And another thing is that at the same time we find urn burials, where bodies were put inside pottery, put inside big jars and buried. And sometimes it's not the bodies themselves, but the ash. So they also had cremations. So we can say just by looking at the dead and how they treated their dead, that Harappan civilization was a multicultural society. And we know that the number of the dead does not equal to the number of people that were living there. Correct? A burial site of say even a massive city like Harappa is only a few hundred, which means a lot of other people were never buried. Maybe they had different cultures, different ways of disposing their dead. So even by their absence, we can get cultural information. Not only that, we have evidence of ritual sacrifice. Everybody is familiar with the Mayans and the Aztecs who used to kill each other and sacrifice them to the gods. We can get those impacts on the skeleton. We have cut marks of the throat. We have cut marks on the ribs where people had to go get their heart out. According to Mayan belief, you need the live beating heart of the person and sacrifice it. So he was still alive when you cut him up and took his heart out. And then you burnt it and then you ate it. You feed the king. And evidence of cannibalism. So an archaeologist, we like our gore, we like our death. So one archaeologist actually won the Ig Nobel Prize. If you guys are familiar with the Ig Nobel Prize, it's basically like the Nobel, but for ideas like why do you do it? Very fun, very crazy idea. So this one archaeologist, what he did, he studied the nutritional value of the human body, because cannibalism is something that we see in the archaeological record. So was it a possible good way of getting actual good source of nutrition, or was it not? What he said is that no, it's not worth it. So if people start cannibalizing, that means they're in very dire circumstances. Or it could be ritual. What we do in archaeology is if we can't find the reason for anything, we just say it's ritual. And at the same time we also find these other objects, okay, this picture that's not displayed there, I'm sorry. That one and the one here, they're actually skull cups. So the skull of a person is taken, cut and shaped into a bowl. Maybe for ritualistic purpose, or maybe it was utilitarian. You kill your enemy and you wanted to, flaunt it. I mean, I think if anybody's seen the Temple of Doom, you see the reference to that, At the same time, you also see the shrunken heads that we see from various Amazonian tribal groups, and also other mortuary paraphernalia. So all of this, when studied by the human skeletal remains, gives us an insight into their cultural beliefs, especially life after death. Not only that, when it comes to art and architecture, one of the things that is represented is the human body. So that implies that they had to be as realistic as possible. They had to study the human body. We know of how Leonardo da Vinci made these sketches of the human body. Why? Because at that point of time, realism was a developing school of thought and painting, and they wanted to be realistic as possible. One quick example, this is from the site of Bhimbetka, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Let's go deeper into one of these art that is depicted. You actually see what is depicted or interpreted as a surgeon. So in Paleolithic times, about 10,000 years ago, in the rock art of Bhimbetka, there is possible surgery that is being depicted. Yeah. So what do we see? So this is, I'm wrapping it up now, so you guys can all be free to go. But yeah, so the future direction of the contribution, which is something that we are trying to do through both the podcast series and the collaboration of the research here, is to define things at a population level. A lot of what we know of the past is Eurocentric, because for the longest time, most of the science was done by Europeans, for Europeans, by Europeans. When as the world is moving beyond Europe, we need to introduce these perspectives. So especially for India and South Asia, where we have different body structures. So if we have to make stature estimation, if you have to identify the sex of a specimen, we can't just fall back on European models. So we need to develop models within South Asia. Also, we need to refine these studies, like I said, by decolonizing perspectives and interpretations, and also degenderizing them. So the default of most things in the past has been mankind. We have to make it human. So hopefully through these works we can introduce new perspectives and helpfully look at that. One more aspect is that the smaller elements of the human body, the ankles, the wrist, the ear bones, they are usually not studied because everybody likes studying things that are big. The bigger the better, right? So we have to move towards studying these things, because see, the wrist bones are important for understanding dexterity. The ankle bones are important for understanding bipedalism. Most of our studies have been focused only on the pelvis or on generally the hand in the modern times. So by studying these things, we can probably refine our understanding of the past. One thing that we're trying to look at is what is called the middle range theory, wherein you can't actually take what is happening in the present as a substitute for the past. You have to build models from what we see in the present and then try and apply those models in the past. So like I said, I break tools, I break stones for a living. So by doing this, I can try and understand the stresses it has on the human body. So if we find skeletal remains, we can see if those match. However, I don't want to kill myself to study my bones. So the development of technology has enabled non-invasive methods of studying modern people. In the past, it was okay, it was ethical, to sacrifice the few for the many. But however, it's not right now. So the development of, say, non-invasive methods and also making these databases and resources open access and easily available is something that we are trying to do with the podcast, especially looking at decimation and scientific communication. So recently we tried to do a small walk here, try to pilot to see if what we are getting from the research, how we can translate it to the general public. And these are examples of tours that we are planning with the museum. I think we can, on that note, and thank you all. I hope you guys had fun.